Okay, so in this learning objective, what we're trying to do is, or what we're going to do, is to develop an explanation or a description of the Fed, which is the Federal Reserve Bank, and exactly what they do. And I'm kind of summarizing that with what we call the dual mandate here. So, more generally, what do I call a central bank? So the Federal Reserve Bank, as we'll see, is our country's central bank. So as we just saw, the growth rate of the money supply has an important implication for inflation in the long run. And we've seen cases where inflation got way out of control, these hyperinflations. And so important question is, well, who controls that money supply? And the answer is, in almost every country, a central bank. Now, the central bank is a monetary authority that is in charge of monetary policy. So monetary policy involves, generally speaking, these three factors, which we'll elaborate on here in a little bit. So it involves, monitoring financial institutions and then some other controls of the money supply and interest rates, which we'll learn about. Now, in the U.S., the Federal Reserve Bank is our central bank. So you've probably heard something recently, if you've been paying attention to the news at all, about the Fed. The Fed did this with interest rates, or the Fed is doing that or that, and it's referring to the Federal Reserve Bank. So there's a link there you can click on and read a little bit more of the details of the Federal Reserve Bank, some of which we'll leave out. But that's our central bank. And so, an important question at the beginning. So the name is a bit misleading. So Federal Reserve Bank, or I call it the Fed, that makes it sound an awful lot like it's a part of the government, part of the federal government. And it turns out that is not the case. So is the Federal Reserve Bank part of the federal government? No. It turns out it's actually a private institution, a private bank, like many other banks. So they don't receive any tax dollars or anything like that. They operate on their own, like most other businesses would. So in fact, I've worked in the past for a Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis. And it's like working for any other company in that sense. Now, there is some link between the government and the Federal Reserve Bank. That link happens because the President of the United States appoints certain members of a key group of people on the Federal Reserve Bank, which is called the Board of Governors. So as we'll see, the Federal Reserve Bank makes certain policy decisions about the money supply and some interest rates. And the group of people officially charged with making those decisions is part of the Federal Reserve Board, or they influence it to some degree, as well as the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, whom right now is someone named Jerome Powell. So all of these people are appointed by our president, which is the only link between the Federal Reserve Bank and the federal government. So that's actually something that's important, is that the Federal Reserve, or any country's central bank, is sufficiently independent from its government. Now, why? Well, we just saw why on the previous pages, which is if the government has control over the central bank, there's a strong tendency for them to use money creation in order to generate additional revenue to finance government spending. And when the government does that too much, as we saw in our previous examples, like in Venezuela recently, that results in hyperinflation, which has lots of bad costs. So we try to keep these two institutions independent. And so it was somewhat exceptional, and recently the President of the United States has been more vocal in suggesting what the Federal Reserve policy should be. And there was a lot of pushback against that. And the reason is that we want to keep the Federal Reserve Bank, our central bank, independent from the government. Okay, so a little bit about what the Federal Reserve is supposed to do, or what their mandate is. So it's not part of the government, but it gets its authority from the government, if that makes any sense. So the Federal Reserve Bank started in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, and it was originally a lender of last resort. Now, what does that mean? A lender of last resort came out of the wave of bank runs that was happening around the turn of the century. So if you go back in our lecture here, I had a graph that showed the number of bank runs or percent of banks that failed through time, and there was big spikes earlier in the century. So right around the turn of the century and through the 1930s, there were a lot more bank failures that were the result of bank runs. And so the Federal Reserve was instituted in order to help prevent that. So if a bank was short on reserves, it was facing a bank run, the Federal Reserve was there to step in and lend that bank some money if they were unable to obtain the money elsewhere. So that is its function as a lender of last resort. Now, it's expanded since then, and it's now, generally speaking, operating under what we call the dual mandate. Now, the dual mandate has two parts, obviously, hence dual. And the first one is to maintain stable prices. And what we really mean by that is to maintain low and stable inflation. So if I was to kind of summarize what the Federal Reserve Bank is really trying to do, is they're trying to keep inflation right around 2%. That's their goal. Now there's some debate, and we may get into this, whether or not they're actually targeting 2% or not. That can make a difference, but at least they, generally speaking, are striving to keep inflation relatively stable at 2%. We've seen already how money supply growth, which the Federal Reserve Bank would control, influences inflation. So they have a big role to play there. The second part of the dual mandate is there to maintain what we call full employment. And we learned in the previous chapter about the natural rate of unemployment, and that's their goal, is to keep the actual unemployment rate close to the natural rate. And so there's two parts to this objective, and those are the main goals of the Federal Reserve. Now, we'll try to understand why. The stable prices part probably makes sense right now. So we've already seen how monetary policy, at least increasing the money supply, is going to impact inflation. And we'll elaborate a little bit on that here moving forward. But that part's clear. You may not fully understand 2 yet, which is something we have to work on. So how could Federal Reserve actions have any influence on the unemployment rate? And in what direction should that move? That'll be some objectives here moving forward. So that's a brief summary of the Federal Reserve Bank and, roughly speaking, what it is they're tasked with in our economy in terms of policy objectives. So up next, we'll kind of break down a few additional details of what they do on a day-to-day basis in our banking system.